The right wheel jerked outward with a metallic snap. "Don't move," Simon Weller said, dropping to one knee before the chair could lean any farther. Nora Hale locked both brakes without waiting for help. Her father, Ruben, caught the gray frame with one broad hand and steadied it beside the steel workbench. A freight train hammered across the overpass above them, making loose sockets tremble in their tray. The old fluorescent tube buzzed sharply. Cold air slipped beneath the rolling door, carrying river damp into the smells of rubber, cutting oil, and detergent trapped in the walls since the building's laundromat years. Simon pressed his left wrist against the axle housing. The pale burn scar around it showed beneath the yellow task lamp. He wore a dark blue work shirt and a brown canvas apron, both marked by years of metal dust. "The bearing didn't fail," he said. "Something is forcing the wheel offline." Ruben remained behind Nora's shoulder. His black canvas jacket faded at both elbows. His silver wedding ring hung from a leather cord at his throat. Outside, his wine-red touring motorcycle waited beneath the broken sign, its patched saddle catching the final gray light. "Can you make it safe?" Ruben asked. Simon looked at him first. Nora answered before he could. "Ask me. It's my chair." Simon stopped, then shifted until he faced her directly. She was 30, with shoulder-length brown curls, a cream sweater, and a mustard scarf tucked safely away from the wheels. A compact tool pouch hung beneath her seat. "May I inspect the rear assembly?" Simon asked. "Tell me what happens if you open it. The supplier may void the warranty. And if you don't?" Simon touched the push rim and watched the wheel pull outward again. "You keep correcting every time the ground slopes. Eventually, that axle may stop holding." Nora glanced once at Ruben. He did not answer for her. "Open it," she said. Simon's phone lit on the bench before he reached for his tools. Final notice filled the screen. 3 months of rent had to be paid by 10 the next morning, or the shop keys were due. He turned the phone face down. Then he lowered the magnifying visor from his forehead and studied the Crestline seal around the axle cover. One edge sat higher than the other. Beneath it, a thin crescent of scraped metal caught the lamp. "They told me no one had opened it," Nora said. "That was in writing." Simon took a caliper from the drawer, but did not break the seal. The compressor coughed once behind him and fell silent. He leaned closer. 2 shallow tool marks sat beneath the seal, both older than the damage that had brought Nora there. Simon looked from the marks to her invoice, then back to the axle. If Crestline had never opened the assembly, who had already been inside it? Ruben released the chair only after Nora nodded that both brakes were holding. He stepped back at once, though the narrow shop gave him almost nowhere to go. His boots stopped beside a faded circle in the concrete where a washing machine had once been bolted down. From the doorway, with broad shoulders, a dark jacket, and a scar curving beneath his left jaw, he looked like the kind of man strangers might avoid. Simon noticed the heavy, touring motorcycle outside and the patched line across its saddle. Then Ruben folded his hands behind his back and waited for his daughter to speak. "I took pictures before we left home," Nora said. She reached beneath her seat and removed a phone, a folding rule, a yellow paint marker from the tool pouch. Simon had expected frustration. He had not expected preparation. She showed him clear photographs of the serial plate, the Crestline seal, and the wheel leaning outward beside a carpenter's square. Every image carried a timestamp. "They said I was overcorrecting when I pushed," she said. "Then they said the floor in my apartment was uneven." Ruben's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. Simon rolled the wheel half a turn. The black push rim whispered against the brake housing. "How long have you been compensating to the left?" 6 weeks. "And your right shoulder?" "Sore by noon." Simon looked at Ruben. "You let her use it like this?" The question came out harder than he intended. Ruben's expression stayed level. "She works. She shops. She decides where she goes." Nora held Simon's gaze. "He asked me to stop using it. I chose not to lose 6 weeks of my life, while Crestline found an appointment." The mistake in Simon's question settled between them. He turned back to the axle. "Understood." Outside, a delivery van slowed beside Ruben's motorcycle, then rolled on. The driver stared long enough to make his judgment obvious. Ruben ignored him. Simon lifted only the loose edge of the seal, exposing the cover screws without removing them. Nora photographed every step. In a scrap tray nearby lay a short copper-color machine core, darkened at one end by old lubricant. Simon picked it up, compared its diameter with the axle opening, then returned it without explanation. It was only a possibility, nothing more. The compressor coughed again. Cold white light flickered across the invoice Nora had placed on a bench. Crestline had billed her for a reinforced load-bearing assembly installed 8 months earlier. Simon slid the caliper beneath the loosened cover and measured the visible washer. He measured twice. Then he checked the technical code printed on the invoice. "What?" Nora asked. Simon did not answer immediately. The washer was almost 3 millimeters smaller than the minimum listed for the assembly she had purchased. That might indicate a careless repair. It might mean the wrong invoice had been attached, or someone might have fitted a cheaper part beneath a seal designed to end questions. Simon studied the old tool marks again. The damaged wool was no longer the strangest thing in the room. They didn't just open this before, he said. They installed something that was never designed for this assembly. Simon had just placed the caliper beside Nora's invoice when the shop phone began ringing. The sound cut through the empty building, sharp against the distant thunder of freight cars. No other business remained open beneath the overpass. Across Grayford, the Crestline showroom still glowed behind polished glass, its mobility devices arranged beneath warm spotlights and spotless signs. Here, one fluorescent tube blinked above stained concrete. Cold air pressed through the rolling door, and the old heater answered with nothing. Simon wiped his fingers on his brown apron before lifting the receiver. "Weller Repair. This is Clive Ralston, Regional Director for Crestline Mobility Supply." The voice was smooth, patient, and already prepared. Clive identified Nora's chair by serial number. He said Crestline had received notice that an unauthorized party was accessing a protected assembly. Simon looked toward Nora. She raised her phone and began recording the time, not the conversation. Ruben remained near the doorway, his black canvas jacket dark against the fading light. He said nothing. "The assembly is unsafe," Simon said. "The installed washer does not match the build unit." A pause followed, brief but not empty. "Temporary stock substitutions are sometimes used during supply delays," Clive replied. Then his tone changed by half a degree. "Manufacturer-approved equivalents, I should say." Simon looked at the undersized washer beneath the loosened cover. He had never told Clive what kind of component he had found. "You know what is inside this axle?" Simon asked. "I know what our records show." "Then send those records." Clive ignored the request. He instructed Simon to close the cover, preserve what remained of the seal, and transfer the chair to Crestline the next morning. Any component removed from the assembly would also need to be surrendered. "Nothing has been removed yet," Simon said. Another silence. Ruben's jaw tightened beneath the curved scar. He did not step forward. Instead, he took a clean evidence bag from Nora's tool pouch and placed it within her reach. "Quiet help. No threat." Clive continued in the same measured voice. If Simon interfered further, Crestline would report an unlicensed modification to the municipal inspector. Simon's computer chimed before the call ended. A new email had arrived. "License compliance review, 7:45 a.m. The notice listed grounding, access, documentation, and calibration requirements Simon had not yet been able to afford. At the bottom was the complainant's company name. Crestline. Ruben glanced at the screen, then toward the rent notice lying face down beside it. "How much time?" he asked. "Not enough," Simon said. Clive remained on the line. "Close the assembly, Mr. Weller. This does not need to become larger than it already is." Simon lifted the axle cover. Nora photographed the tool marks, the washer, and the partial production code beneath it. At 6:49, her next photograph still showed the original component seated inside the axle. Simon removed it only afterward, placing it into the clear bag while Nora wrote the time across the seal. The stamped prefix read LT 14. The code proved nothing by itself. What mattered was that Clive had described a temporary substitute before Simon had named any part. Simon sealed the evidence. By morning, Crestline would control the complaint, the warranty, and the inspection schedule. Simon controlled only the component on his bench. Simon set the sealed LT-14 component beneath the task lamp, then reached into the scrap tray for the copper-color machine core. It was no longer simply discarded metal. He measured the axle opening, checked the wheel angle under load, and wrote 3 numbers along the edge of Nora's invoice. The old lathe stood beside the wall where 6 washing machines had once spun through the night. When Simon switched it on, the motor groaned before settling into a steady rhythm. Copper shavings curled into the tray. The smell of cutting oil warmed the cold shop, and yellow light flashed across his magnifying visor. "You making a replacement?" Ruben asked. "A temporary alignment key," Simon said. "Only until it passes an independent load test." Nora watched beside the workbench, her gray chair supported on blocks. Without its rear wheel, she could not leave under her own power. That fact settled over the room more heavily than the compliance notice. Crestline said temporary parts were dangerous, she said. Simon kept his eyes on the lathe. Temporary is not the same as unknown. I can document the material, every measurement, and every cut, but it will still look homemade. It is homemade. The answer landed harder than he intended. Nora looked toward the dark window, where Ruben's wine-red motorcycle reflected beneath the broken sign. "People already assume anything built for me is charity," she said. "If they see that piece, they'll say I accepted something unsafe because I couldn't afford better." Her voice stayed level, but one hand tightened around the black push rim. She was not frightened by the metal. She feared being reduced to a warning story told by people who had never asked what she chose. Simon stopped the lathe. "Then we do not ask anyone to trust it," he said. "We make them measure it." Nora released the rim. She rolled closer while Ruben shifted the blocks without being asked. Together, Nora and Simon checked the drawing, the bearing clearance, and the added tolerance required when her weight settled into the frame. Simon cut 3 small file marks into one end of the finished key. "Orientation marks," he explained. "If they face inward, it is installed correctly." Ruben mistook them for a signature. Simon corrected him. "A signature proves who made it. These prove how it works." He installed the copper camber key, tightened the assembly, and lowered the chair. Nora pushed once. The wheel tracked straight. She crossed the shop, turned beside the old detergent shelves, and returned without pulling left. For 6 weeks, every movement had required correction. Now the chair followed the line she chose. Ruben placed folded bills on the bench. Simon pushed them back. She already paid for the part she was promised. At 9:12, Nora photographed the finished repair and the LT-14 stamp inside the evidence bag. The metal carried a manufacturing date 14 months earlier. Simon warned that its age did not prove when Crestline acquired it. Nora agreed. The stronger question was whether LT-14 appeared anywhere in the service records Crestline had already sent her. Nora opened the service folder on her phone and searched for LT-14. The shop had grown colder, and the fluorescent light above the empty washer circles flickered twice. Simon reheated coffee behind them, filling the air with a bitter smell no one found comforting. The search produced one email from 8 months earlier, sent during the week Crestline claimed the reinforced assembly had been installed. Nora enlarged the service note. Installed item, LT-14 temporary substitute. Farther down, the billing attachment listed the reinforced load-bearing assembly. The service status read closed. "I thought this meant they were waiting before scheduling me," she said. Simon read the line again. They recorded the substitute, charged for the reinforced unit, and closed the repair. Ruben studied the invoice without touching it. An hour earlier, they had believed someone might have installed the wrong part through carelessness. Now the documents described 2 different versions of the same service. One field showed what went in Nora's chair. Another showed what she paid to receive. The damaged wool was no longer evidence of a single bad decision. It was evidence that a temporary measure had been treated as finished work. The discovery did not prove how many people knew or how often it had happened. It proved something narrower and more dangerous. Crestline's own paperwork had preserved the difference. Simon looked toward the sealed LT-14 component. Until that moment, he had been trying to protect Nora's chair and survive the morning inspection. Now, preserving the evidence mattered more than defending his workmanship. "We need an independent measurement," he said, "and another invoice if one exists." Ruben removed his phone, but did not begin calling immediately. "A man I ride with has a brother who uses a Crestline chair," he said. "Same pulling problem last winter." Nora's expression tightened. "Do not turn me into a story people pass around." "I won't. And no collection." "No collection," Simon added. "No one comes here to frighten an inspector." Ruben met his eyes. "Then they come only if they can bring something useful." He stepped beneath the broken wash sign, where cold river air sharpened the old detergent smell. At 10:05, he typed one message to the Copper Mile riders: "Need trades, records, and anyone holding a Crestline invoice. No crowding. No threats. Be useful." He read it twice before sending. The first reply arrived in less than 1 minute. It was not an offer of money. It was a photograph of another Crestline invoice showing a reinforced billing code. Beneath it, the service note carried the same LT-14 substitute prefix. Ruben looked at Nora before replying. "Names covered. Documents only," she said. Ruben sent the instruction. Their goal had changed. They were no longer trying merely to save Simon's shop. They had to prove the truth without allowing anyone to turn the truth into a spectacle. The first motorcycle arrived at 4:48 in the morning, its engine dropping to a low idle beneath the freight overpass. Ruben had organized the arrivals before anyone started riding. People carrying documents or assigned trade tools parked on the block nearest the shop. Everyone else lined the second industrial block and remained with their motorcycles. Each group had a time window, a task, and a name on the clipboard. Ruben guided the first rider into an open space along the curb, keeping the warehouse entrance clear. A second motorcycle followed, then 3 more. Their headlights crossed the old windows in pale bands, revealing dust, tool cabinets, and faded circles in the concrete floor. No one raised a voice. Each engine shut down before the next rider parked. Simon stood inside with his arms folded, watching dark jackets and cold breath spread along the street. "This looks exactly like what I told you not to do," he said. Ruben handed him the clipboard. Every arrival had a name, trade, purpose, and time. One electrician carried a tester and replacement outlets. A bookkeeper brought a portable scanner. 2 riders had Crestline invoices belonging to adult relatives who had reported similar steering problems. Another brought coffee in plain paper cups and left one beside Nora without asking whether she needed help opening it. She did not. That mattered. By 5:05, the electrician had located a grounding fault near Simon's old lathe. He replaced the damaged connection, photographed the work, and signed the compliance sheet. A retired building inspector measured the entrance rail and marked one loose anchor. A carpenter tightened it with hardware from his truck, then wrote down the part number and cost. Simon tried to offer cash. The carpenter refused the money, but accepted a written work order. "Pay when the shop is operating," he said. "That makes this business, not charity." At the steel table, Nora and the bookkeeper sorted 4 Crestline invoices by service date. Each showed a reinforced billing code. 3 contained notes referring to an LT-14 substitute. The 4th lacked a service note entirely. Nora covered names, addresses, and account details before anyone copied them. "Evidence is not permission to expose people," she said. Ruben nodded and moved the completed pages in separate folders. Outside, motorcycles formed 2 orderly lines across the 2 blocks. A rider in a reflective vest photographed the open emergency lane and unobstructed ramp. Another placed small cones at the corners so late arrivals would not block neighboring doors. By 5:31, the 95th rider lowered his kickstand beside Ruben's wine-red touring bike. The street was full. The entrances were not. Simon looked through the glass and understood what the number meant. These people had not come to save him from consequences. They had come to make sure the correct consequences reached the correct place. Then a woman across the street raised her phone and recorded only the rows of motorcycles. She did not film the signed work orders, the redacted invoices, or the clear emergency lane. 10 minutes later, Clive received the video. His message reached the municipal inspector before sunrise. Organized intimidation at an active compliance review. If the evidence appeared tied to a threatening crowd, it could be dismissed before anyone measured the LT-14 part. Simon could lose his license because of the very help meant to protect it. The municipal inspector arrived at 7:45, glanced once at the 2 blocks of motorcycles, and kept his expression unreadable. Clive Ralston arrived 20 minutes later in a gray coat, carrying a tablet and a printed complaint. His shoes remained clean, even on the stained concrete. That detail irritated Simon more than it should have. Outside, Ruben raised one hand, and every rider stepped farther from the entrance. No engine started. No one argued. The inspector checked the repaired outlet, the entrance rail, and the written work orders. Each improvement met the required standard. Then Clive placed the complaint on the steel table. He described Simon's work as an unauthorized modification performed under pressure from an organized group. He pointed to the copper camber key inside Nora's axle and called it an untested homemade component. Simon removed the key and placed it beside the sealed LT-14 part. Under the white morning light, its 3 file marks looked less like careful orientation guides and more like the signature of an amateur. That was how Clive wanted everyone to see them. The chair now tracks correctly, Nora said. Clive turned toward the inspector instead of her. Temporary function does not establish safety. Neither does a corporate seal, Nora replied. The inspector asked for an independent load certificate. Simon had none yet. The technician Ruben contacted was delayed by a road closure near the river. Clive opened his tablet and displayed Crestline's warranty terms. Once a protected assembly was opened by an outside shop, he said later measurements could be challenged as contaminated. He spoke calmly, almost regretfully. The argument was working. The inspector explained that Simon's mobility device authorization might require temporary suspension until the part could be examined by a certified third party. Nora looked at the restored wheel. 6 weeks of fighting the chair had ended, yet the repair now threatened to close the only shop willing to examine why it had failed. Withdraw my complaint against Crestline, she said. Use my case as a private repair. Leave Simon out of it. Simon shook his head. That would not change what was installed. It might keep your doors open. For what? So I can ignore the next one. His phone showed 8:36. The landlord's deadline was less than 90 minutes away. Simon took the shop key from his pocket and set it beside the rent notice. The small brass key landed near the copper one. One opened the building. The other had opened a question no one wanted asked. Clive slid his complaint toward the inspector and urged him to issue the suspension before the crowd outside made the review harder to control. Ruben heard through the open door. He did not enter. Instead, he asked the riders to move behind the painted curb line, leaving Simon, Nora, and the evidence entirely visible. Nora read the complaint again. It had been created at 6:42 the previous evening and stated that Simon had already removed and replaced Crestline's internal component. She opened her photograph stamped 6:49. In it, the original LT-14 part was still seated inside the axle beneath the raised cover. The complaint had not merely been prepared early. It described an act that had not happened yet. Nora turned both time stamps toward the inspector. This was written before there was anything to report, she said. The inspector looked at the internal work order number printed near the bottom. Can your system retrieve this record? He asked. Clive's hand stopped above the tablet. Clive's hand remained above the tablet, but he did not enter the work order number. The inspector waited. No one filled the silence for him. Outside, 95 riders stood behind the painted curb line, leaving the shop entrance open and the steel table visible from the street. Ruben watched Clive through the glass, then quietly asked the rider in the reflective vest for the parking photographs and arrival log. He did not carry them inside himself. He handed them to Nora. He needs the motorcycles to be the story, Ruben said, because the measurements are harder to argue with. Nora placed the photographs at the far end of the table. They showed the emergency lane open at 4:52, 5:11, and 5:31. The arrival log listed each rider's trade, purpose, and time. The inspector examined both documents and added them to the review file without comment. At 8:47, a white service van stopped beyond the final motorcycle. The independent technician entered carrying a sealed measurement case and a printed calibration certificate. He introduced himself, stated that he had no business relationship with Simon or Coppermile Riders, and asked that every item be presented in its documented condition. Simon stepped away from the table. Nora controlled the order. First came the photographs of the Crestline seal, each with its timestamp. Next came the chair's external serial number and original invoice. She placed the sealed LT14 component beside them, followed by the copper camber key with its 3 file marks facing upward. Under clear morning light, the small piece no longer resembled a miracle or an amateur shortcut. It looked like a comparison standard waiting to be tested. Nora added the drawings for both component families, the 4 redacted invoices, and Clive's complaint containing the internal work order number and impossible timeline. The technician set his calibrated instrument last. The foam inside the case smelled new, sharply different from cutting oil and detergent. Clive finally entered the work order number. A login screen appeared, followed by a request for regional authorization. He hesitated. The inspector reminded him that his own complaint relied upon the record's existence. Refusing access would be noted as failure to support the allegation. Clive entered his credentials. The record opened, but he angled the screen toward himself. "Before we proceed," he said, "these outside invoices have not been authenticated." Nora did not touch them. "Then begin with mine." The seal was broken. The photographs show its condition before that happened. The replacement key is uncertified. That is why no one is asking you to trust it. Simon remained beside the brass shop key and rent notice. Ruben stayed outside. He understood the weakness in Clive's position. Clive needed every item judged separately because together they described a sequence. The inspector instructed the technician to measure the removed component first and read every value aloud. Nora requested that each number enter the official record before anyone discussed its meaning. The technician broke the evidence seal in full view, removed the LT14 part, and positioned it beneath the measuring head. Clive stepped toward the table. "I object to this procedure." The inspector looked up. Under which written rule? Clive's eyes moved from the time-stamped photographs to his open database. He gave no answer. The measuring probe descended until it touched the metal. The display cleared and began forming the first number. The first number appeared on the calibrated display, and the technician read it aloud. The sealed LT14 component belonged to the light-duty family, not the reinforced assembly listed on Nora's invoice. A second measurement showed the washer was undersized. A third confirmed were caused by carrying load at the wrong angle. The inspector entered every value before anyone spoke. Clive kept one hand on his tablet. "The outside shop altered the system," he said. Nora turned her photographs toward him. The 649 image showed the original component still inside the axle, along with tool marks beneath the Crestline seal. The technician then measured the copper camber key. Its 3 file marks aligned it correctly, and its dimensions matched the axle drawing under load. It was not a miracle. It was a precise repair that could be tested. The load check confirmed Nora's chair tracked safely with the key installed. The inspector ordered Clive to display the internal work order named in his own complaint. The installed inventory field showed LT14. The customer billing field showed the more expensive reinforced code. Beneath both sat the note Clive had tried to soften: substitution pending final stock release. The authorization history carried his credential beside the decision to close the repair without a final stock replacement. The record had been closed 8 months earlier. Why was the temporary item left in service? The inspector asked. Clive answered carefully. The branch had discretion to close functional repairs while managing margin targets. No confession followed. None was needed. His own policy language connected the substitute, the closed file, and the higher billing code. Outside, 95 riders remained beyond the curb. None moved. Ruben stood beside his wine-red touring motorcycle with the arrival log and parking photographs. Their silence removed Clive's final excuse. If he denied the measurement, he challenged the independent technician. If he denied the database, he challenged his own company. If he continued the complaint, both codes and the premature report would remain attached to the official review. Crestline withdraws the allegation against Mr. Weller, he said. The inspector preserved the records, referred the billing pattern for independent review, and confirmed that Simon's repaired wiring, entrance rail, documentation, and calibration plan met the required standards. At 9:43, a Copper Mile member who managed an adult transport service signed a 6-month maintenance contract at market rates. The first retainer covered Simon's overdue rent before 10. No collection jar appeared. No one handed him charity. He received work. Later, Ruben told Nora he had once sold his first motorcycle to help pay for her equipment. He had hidden it because he never wanted her independence to feel like a debt. For months later, Weller Mobility Works had a proper ramp and a wheelchair-height bench beside Simon's hire one. Nora worked there as a paid technical partner, reviewing drawings and parts records. In a clear case between the benches rested the wrong LT-14 component, the copper camber key, and their first sign measurement sheet. Ruben rolled in another customer's wheel assembly. 3 motorcycles waited outside for scheduled service. Above them, the new sign read Weller Mobility Works, Repair, Measure, Verify. Beneath it, 2 faded letters from Wash still glowed. Simon glanced at them once, then returned to the caliper in his hand. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe for more biker stories. This is a fictional story created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.